The air in the Celestial Apex Academy was different.
It wasn't just the scent, crisp and artificial.
Purified to accommodate the dozens of species living here. It was the weight of expectation, the silent pressure pressing down on Jake Pierce's shoulders as he stepped off the docking ramp onto the Academy's main platform. He wasn't supposed to be here. That much was obvious from the way the crowd of students parted slightly, not out of respect, but out of disinterest. To them, he was nothing, a human, a curiosity at best, an irrelevance at worst. They had seen warriors with big strength, engineers who could reassemble a fusion core with their bare hands. What did humanity have? What did he have? The answer wasn't clear, not yet. A sharp chime echoed through the towering halls as Jake approached the Academy's orientation concourse, a place where each new species was welcomed with elaborate ceremonies. The room was vast, gleaming with bronze and obsidian, lit by floating data displays that projected the names of every attending race. Towering crystalline sculptures reflected soft pulses of light, each color-coded to represent a different world. His name wasn't on any of them. Neither was his planet's. His footsteps faltered. Maybe they hadn't updated the registry. Maybe it was an oversight. Or maybe, deep down, the Celestial Apex had already decided that humans weren't worth mentioning. The murmuring started before he could turn around. "Is that him?" A hushed voice, somewhere behind him. "The human? I thought they were taller. I thought they were stronger." A slow ripple of attention spread through the crowd. Jake didn't need to look up to know what was happening. He was being sized up, evaluated, judged before he'd even had the chance to prove himself. His pulse quickened. But he forced himself to keep walking, keep his chin level. He had promised himself he wouldn't let their opinions get to him. But then, something unexpected happened. The murmurs stopped. The air itself seemed to be still, and when Jake turned his head, he saw her, Miles Navarus. The Zarathian scholar stood in the center of the concourse, arms folded behind her back, violet eyes locked on Jake with a gaze that felt. Zarathians were a species known for their absolute rationality, beings who made decisions solely on logic, untouched by emotion. Yet something in her expression wasn't just analysis. It was something deeper. "You are the human," she said. Jake swallowed. "That's me." Miles took a single step forward. Around them, the crowd leaned in, anticipation thickening the air. "What are you capable of?" she asked. The words were simple. The challenge in them was not. Jake opened his mouth to answer. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the air, deep, commanding, edged with sharp amusement. "The real question," the voice drawled, "is whether he's capable of anything at all." The crowd turned as one. A figure strode into the concourse, tall and impossibly poised, his golden-toned skin catching the overhead lights like molten metal. The intricate facial markings along his temples shimmered, a sign of Orion nobility, the kind of being who carried authority without needing to announce it. Kalis Dur. If the Academy's rumors were true, someone who had never lost a challenge. Jake recognized him instantly. Everyone did. Kalis's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I have studied your species," he mused, his voice carrying easily across the hushed chamber. "Warriors, traitors, survivors, and yet, here you stand. Not as a soldier, not as a scientist, but as what? A diplomat? A thinker?" He tilted his head, gold-lit eyes gleaming. "No, that's not quite it." His gaze swept over Jake. "You're something far simpler." The room went silent. Jake blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" Kalis's amusement didn't falter. "Humans, I have learned, do not simply consume for survival. They indulge. They seek out the strange, the impossible, the dangerous." He stepped closer, his presence towering, almost suffocating. "Tell me, human, how much of the galaxy's cuisine have you tasted?" Jake stared at him. This was not the conversation he expected to have on his first day. He started, glancing at Miles, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "I mean, I've had sushi before." Kalis huffed a quiet laugh. "Then let's test a theory." He extended a hand toward the grand archway at the far end of the concourse. "The Sunspire Cafe, the finest culinary establishment in this sector, a place where no species dares to eat outside their own kind." Jake didn't miss the way the students around them shifted, some stepping back, others leaning in as if sensing blood in the water. "You claim humanity is worth remembering?" Kalis's voice was smooth and confident.
Then prove it. Eat.
Then, a flicker of something inside Jake's chest. It was absurd. Ridiculous. This wasn't the kind of challenge he had expected to face. A slow grin curled across his lips.
All right,
he said, adjusting the strap of his travel bag. But just so we're clear, Kalis raised an eyebrow. When I'm done, Jake continued, his voice light but edged with something sharper, stronger. You're the one buying me dinner. The Sunspire Cafe wasn't just a dining hall. It was a monument to culinary excellence, a sprawling, multi-leveled masterpiece suspended within the heart of the celestial apex. Ornate archways framed its entrance, their copper and obsidian filigree reflecting the soft, pulsating glow of the artificial skylights above. Towering support beams stretched toward the ceiling like the trunks of ancient trees, their surfaces etched with holographic menus displaying thousands of dishes from every known civilization. Jake had barely stepped inside before the first whisper ran through the room like a ripple through still water. He's actually going to do it. The human. He can't be serious. This should be interesting. It wasn't just students watching him now. Faculty, kitchen staff, and even the automated drones that hovered above the food stations seemed to pause mid-flight, their sensors whirring as if to capture the moment. The entire room was aware of what was happening. Kalis walked with the effortless confidence of someone who had already won. His golden-toned skin reflected the ambient light as he strode toward the central platform, where a row of floating tables hovered just above the polished floor. He gestured toward the open expanse before them. Choose a station, he said, voice smooth, unreadable. Show us what humanity is made of. Jake folded his arms, scanning the room. Every species had its own designated section, an area carefully calibrated to meet its unique nutritional and environmental needs. The Zerathians, like Miles, dined beneath an array of ultraviolet lamps that cast their bioluminescent meals in a mesmerizing glow. The Parthians, a wolf-like species, consumed precise, protein-rich cubes designed for peak metabolic efficiency. And then there were the Orion delicacies, Kalis's specialty. Intricately plated dishes, arranged with such delicate precision, they looked more like art than sustenance. Jake's stomach growled. His gaze drifted to the farthest station, one that stood apart from the rest. A crystalline barrier enclosed it, its surface humming softly with energy as if warning against reckless curiosity. Inside, a molten chef, an entity composed of shimmering liquid metal, delicately stirred a vat of superheated plasma. Jake pointed. That one. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp swept the room. Someone choked on their drink. A Zerathian student dropped their datapad, eyes wide with disbelief. Even Kalis, who had remained perfectly composed until now, blinked. You can't be serious, Kalis said, his amusement momentarily faltering. Jake shrugged. Why not? That is, Miles stepped forward now, her voice unusually sharp. That is food for beings who consume raw energy. Their digestive systems are capable of metabolizing plasma at temperatures exceeding several thousand degrees Kelvin. Jake turned to her. And? Miles hesitated. And you are not one of them. A flicker of doubt surfaced in Jake's mind. All right, maybe this was a terrible idea. Maybe this was the dumbest thing he'd ever attempted. But something inside him refused to back down. His entire life, humans had been dismissed. He had seen it in the skeptical stares and heard it in the murmured conversations when they thought he wasn't listening. What they didn't understand, what no species seemed to grasp, was that humanity's strength had never been in their biology. It had always been in their adaptability. I'll take a sample, Jake said finally. The molten chef stopped stirring. Its shifting metal form elongated, two liquid-like appendages extending outward as it observed him in absolute silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a fluid movement, the entity lifted a shimmering ladle from the vat. It swirled the contents in midair, brilliant, iridescent streams of liquid fire dancing like a living sun, before releasing a single droplet into a floating containment field. Jake reached for it. Kalis exhaled sharply. And if it affects you, I am not responsible. Jake grinned. Good thing I'm not planning to today. And before anyone could stop him, before Miles could object, before the gathered crowd could process what was happening, he popped the droplet into his mouth. It warmth, spreading through his tongue, cascading down his throat in a rush of pure energy, like standing beneath the sun on a crisp autumn morning. The taste was impossible to describe, somewhere between smoky caramel and electric citrus, an entirely new spectrum of flavor his brain struggled to comprehend. Silence gripped the cafe. Jake blinked, then grinned. Not bad. The reaction was immediate. The Porthian students howled in disbelief. The Zarathians murmured in shock, their luminous skin flickering wildly. The gored warriors, who prided themselves on their iron stomachs, watched with newfound respect. And Kalis, for the first time since their encounter, the Orion chef looked genuinely intrigued. "You truly are insane," he murmured. Jake wiped his mouth. "Nah," he said. "Just hungry." Kalis exhaled through his nose, his golden-hued skin catching the light as he studied Jake with something dangerously close to amusement. The cafe was still locked in stunned silence, every eye trained on the human who had just done the impossible. Jake could feel the heat lingering in his throat, the aftertaste settling in his chest. His heart pounded, not just from the lingering warmth, but from the sheer insanity of what had just happened. He had expected pain. He had expected failure. Instead, he had felt alive. And that, he realized, was why he had done it. The first lesson humanity had ever learned wasn't how to survive. It was how to push limits, test boundaries, walk into the unknown, and make it their own. Kalis broke the silence first. "Interesting." He took a slow step forward. The amusement in his voice edged with something sharper now. "Very interesting." Jake wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and grinned. "Told you. Not bad." Kalis tilted his head slightly. "I'll admit, I didn't expect you to survive that, but eating something designed for a species of living plasma is one thing." He clasped his hands behind his back, his expression calculating. "The question remains, was that luck or skill?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "You think I cheated?" Kalis let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I think you're reckless, not deceitful. But I also think that was one dish. And if humanity wishes to prove itself, a single stunt will not suffice." He stepped closer, his golden eyes gleaming. "You claim humans adapt, that they innovate, that they transform the simple into the extraordinary." His gaze flickered toward the nearest dining stations, where alien chefs still watched in wary fascination. "Then show us." The cafe shifted. It was subtle at first, the way the crowd leaned in, the way the low hum of conversation began to rise. Jake could feel it in the air, the challenge, the test. It had been unspoken before, but now Kalis had set the rules. It wasn't enough to prove humans could consume. Now, he had to create. For a moment, Jake hesitated. He wasn't a chef. He didn't have a fraction of Kalis's experience, nor the knowledge of the thousands of species present in the celestial apex. But then, something clicked in his mind. This wasn't about expertise. This was about proving something bigger. He looked to Kalis. "Fine. Do you want proof? Then I'll make you something." Kalis gestured toward the kitchen platforms lining the cafe's inner circle. "Choose your station." Jake turned, surveying his options. The alien cooking areas weren't built for humans. Some stations were submerged in liquid environments. Others operated under different gravitational fields, their ingredients floating mid-air, constantly in motion. There were flame-forged ovens meant for heat-resistant species, and cryogenic prep areas where sub-zero ingredients were stored in containment fields. He stepped forward, choosing a neutral cooking zone, a modular station meant for experimental cuisine. He set his hands on the cool metal surface, inhaled, and let his mind do what humans do best, solve problems. Jake turned back to Kalis. "Ever had a croissant?" Kalis's brow furrowed slightly. "A what?" Jake cracked his knuckles. "Guess you're about to find out." The cafe reacted immediately. Murmurs spread. Students whispered in hushed tones, some of them pulling up their data pads to search for the unfamiliar word. Even Miles Navarus, who had remained a silent observer until now, shifted closer, curiosity flickering behind her normally emotionless gaze. Kalis folded his arms. "And what, exactly, is a croissant?" Jake smirked. "It's bread, but better." A flicker of something, amusement? Skepticism? Crossed Kalis's face. "Bread." He said the word like it was an alien concept. And to be fair, in this place, it probably was. Jake ignored the skepticism and turned to the station's interface, pulling up the available ingredient list. This was the real challenge. There was no flour, no butter, no yeast at least, not in the way Earth had them. He would have to adapt, substitute, and improvise. He found a grain closest to wheat, denser, darker, with a slightly nutty aroma. The fat substitute was trickier. Butter didn't exist in intergalactic cuisine, but there was a form of crystallized lipid compound that melted at the right temperature. It wasn't exact, but it was close enough. Time moved differently when he worked. He measured, he mixed, he kneaded, shaping the dough with movements that were both careful and instinctive. He had no formal training, no technique passed down by master bakers, but he had watched his grandmother make bread on lazy Sunday mornings, had seen the way her hands pressed into the dough, had felt the patience required to turn simple ingredients into something alive. By the time the first round of laminated folds was complete, the cafe had fallen into absolute silence. Even Kalis was watching now. Jake worked fast. He had no rolling pin, so he used a supercooled metal cylinder designed for molecular gastronomy. He had no proper oven. So he hacked the temperature settings on a convection unit meant for atmospheric-dependent cooking. He folded, layered, and waited, and then finally he baked. The smell hit first, warm, golden, irresistible. Jake barely had time to react before the entire cafe collectively leaned forward, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright awe. This was different from the plasma stunt. That had been shock value. This was alchemy. When he pulled the croissants from the oven, they were imperfect but unmistakable. Layers of flaky, delicate crust spiraled outward, their surfaces crisped to a perfect golden hue. The alien ingredients had altered the color slightly, but the essence was there. He set the tray down, exhaling, his heart hammering. Kalis stepped forward. The Orion reached out, taking one of the croissants between his fingers, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he simply observed it, turning it slightly, feeling the delicate give of the outer crust. Then, without a word, he took a bite. The reaction was subtle, a sharp inhale, a shift in posture. And then slowly, carefully, Kalis closed his eyes. Finally, Kalis swallowed, opened his eyes, and smiled. "Not bad," he murmured. Jake grinned. "Told you." Kalis lowered the croissant slowly, his golden eyes narrowing as if trying to dissect what had just happened. The cafe was silent, tension coiling in the air like a held breath. Every species present, students, faculty, even the kitchen staff, had stopped what they were doing to witness this moment. The Orion chef was known for his uncompromising standards, and his refusal to acknowledge anything short of perfection. And yet, for the first time since Jake had met him, Kalis wasn't speaking. The Orion inhaled sharply, his fingers lightly brushing against the flakes of crisped pastry clinging to his fingertips. He glanced down at them, almost in disbelief. Then, very slowly, he raised his eyes to Jake. "This," Kalis said, his voice lower, steadier than before, "should not have worked." Jake wiped his hands on his apron, lifting an eyebrow. "And yet," Kalis exhaled through his nose, "and yet." A murmur rippled through the cafe. The realization hit all at once. Kalis, the unshakable perfectionist, the undisputed authority of intergalactic cuisine, had just admitted something unprecedented. A human had made something that shouldn't have been possible, and it was good. The impact was immediate. A Parthian student leaned forward, his sharp canines glinting in curiosity. A Zarathian scholar tilted her head, her bioluminescent markings flickering in fascinated confusion. Even the gored warriors, who had spent the entire demonstration watching with folded arms and skeptical gazes, exchanged glances that bordered on approval. But Kalis wasn't done. He turned, his expression thoughtful as he examined the tray of croissants before him. "Do you know why I issued this challenge?" His voice was measured now, calculated. Jake crossed his arms. "Because you wanted to prove humans are reckless?" Kalis smirked. "That was part of it." He gestured toward the gathered students. "But more than that, I wanted to understand." His fingers traced the edge of the counter. "Every species has its culinary philosophy. The Parthians focus on efficiency, pure sustenance. The Zarathians treat food as chemistry, precise, measured." His gaze flickered toward the gourd table. "The gourds? They see it as an extension of strength, a conquest of flavor, a test of will." His golden eyes returned to Jake. "But you?" He lifted the croissant slightly. "This isn't food for survival. It isn't fuel. It's something else entirely." He took another bite, chewing slowly before swallowing. "It's memory. It's culture.
He paused.
His expression shifting into something almost introspective. Jake watched him, his throat tightening slightly. He knew that look, that moment when someone understood. Kalis set the croissant down carefully, as if acknowledging something much larger than just a single dish.
I underestimated you, he admitted finally. I underestimated your species.
A hush fell over the room. The weight of those words landed like a shockwave, rippling through the watching crowd. Jake took a breath, steadying himself.
Humans have a saying, he said,
his voice quieter now, more grounded.
Food isn't just something we consume.
It's something we share. We pass down recipes for generations. We gather around meals to tell stories. A simple loaf of bread can carry centuries of history, of struggle, of triumph. It's a way to connect. He hesitated, then glanced at Miles, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Her violet eyes studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached forward, hesitantly, deliberately, and picked up one of the croissants. A Zarathian eating human food? That was unheard of. But Miles didn't hesitate. She took a bite, her bioluminescent markings pulsing softly as she processed the unfamiliar taste. And then, something changed. Her breath caught. Her expression flickered, just for a second, with something unmistakable. She swallowed, her gaze flickering downward as if trying to place the sensation, to understand why something so simple had hit her so deeply. And then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the murmurs, she whispered, "Warm." Jake's stomach clenched. He didn't know why that single word hit him so hard, but it did. Kalis's gaze flickered between them, the gears in his mind clearly turning. He straightened, then turned to the room. "We will be adding this to the Academy's menu." A gourd warrior slammed his fist against the table in approval, his four eyes gleaming. The Porthians let out sharp barks of intrigue, already discussing potential nutritional values. The Zarathians, who rarely displayed emotion, whispered among themselves, their markings glowing in new patterns as they analyzed the experience. And Jake just let out a slow breath, watching as something shifted in the way the Academy looked at him as something worth remembering. Jake stood in the center of the cafe, the sounds of excited conversation swirling around him like a storm. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement. A change, subtle but undeniable. For the first time since he had arrived at the celestial apex, they weren't looking at him like some fragile outsider, some primitive species that had stumbled into a world beyond its depth. They were looking at him as something else. Kalis still held the last remnants of the croissant in his fingers, his golden skin catching the ambient light. He studied the half-eaten pastry with an almost absent-minded focus, as if he were analyzing something far greater than the sum of its parts. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "This is not a victory," he said, his voice carrying over the gathered students. "This is a beginning." The murmurs in the cafe stilled. Jake met his gaze, heartbeat steady. Kalis turned slightly, gesturing toward the chefs who had gathered along the edge of the platform. Food, at its core, is an expression of identity, of history, of power, and today, I have learned that humanity wields it in a way none of us have considered. He set the remaining croissant back onto the tray, folding his hands behind his back. I would be a fool to dismiss that. A Parthian student, the one who had been silently taking notes on the nutritional properties of human food, raised his hand. What other dishes does humanity have?" Jake blinked. He had been so focused on the challenge, on proving Kalis wrong, that he hadn't thought about what came next. But as he looked around the room, at the dozens of different species watching him with something new in their eyes, curiosity, respect, even anticipation, he realized something. This wasn't just about food. This was about connection. His grin returned, slower this time, less cocky, and more genuine. "Well," he said, stretching his arms behind his head, "if you thought that was impressive, wait till I tell you about pizza." The Porthian perked up immediately. "What is pizza?" Jake chuckled. "Oh, buddy, you're gonna love this." Miles, who had remained unnervingly silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke. "And wine," and she said, eyes locked on him with quiet intensity. "You mentioned a fermented grape beverage?" Jake nearly choked on his own breath. "Oh, man, yeah. Actually, yeah. Fermented drinks are kind of a big deal for us. The Zarathian nodded, her markings glowing faintly. I would like to understand. Kalis exhaled, rubbing his temple. I have created a distinctive. Jake smirked. You asked for proof. I'm just getting started. The crowd leaned in, voices overlapping now, requests being thrown his way from all directions. What is cake? What does grilled mean? Explain barbecue. Tell me about spices. Jake let out a deep, satisfied breath, the exhaustion of the day settling in. But it was a good kind of exhaustion. He had come here expecting to survive, maybe even tolerate his time at Celestial Apex. But now he belonged. Kalis finally lifted a hand, silencing the growing noise. He turned toward Jake, eyes gleaming. If humanity wishes to share its knowledge of cuisine, then I believe the Academy should accommodate. The excitement hit like a shockwave. Jake blinked. Wait, what? Kalis tilted his head slightly. I believe the best way to understand something is to experience it. His expression shifted, an amused glint flashing across his gaze. Which is why, as of today, I am adding a new program to the Celestial Apex curriculum. Jake narrowed his eyes. Kalis. The Orion chef's smile widened just slightly. I propose a human culinary course, he said. Taught by you. Jake's brain short-circuited for a full 3 seconds. He stared at Kalis, then at Miles, who looked unreasonably pleased about this development, then at the entire room of aliens now demanding to know when they could sign up. Oh, no, he blurted. Kalis's smile didn't falter. Oh, yes. I don't even have a degree, Jake said. Kalis smiled and replied, You have experience, which, for once, matters more. Jake ran a hand through his hair, mouth opening, then closing, then opening again. He turned to Miles for support, but the Zarathian merely blinked at him, tilting her head. I believe this is what you humans call... She paused, considering. A checkmate? Jake groaned. Somehow, against all odds, he had become the first human culinary instructor in galactic history.